Welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid, and I'm here with my co-host, Grid contributing editor Matthew Iglesias. Hey, Matt.
Hello. What's happening?
Not much. I'm ready to talk about a bad take.
Okay, here we go. So this is a good one. So Nikki Haley, she used to be the governor of South Carolina. She was UN ambassador under Donald Trump. She is launching a quixotic presidential campaign as we speak, one of the few announced candidates. She went to CPAC, which is an annual gathering of the conservative movement faithful. She gave a speech where, among other things, she said that wokeness is a virus more dangerous than any pandemic.
That's hot. That's a hot take.
Just set the discourse groundwork. The like specific context in which you brought this up, she was complaining about Don Lemon, the CNN anchor, who, in a bad take of his own, had earlier said that Nikki Haley is past her prime because she's in her 50s, which in turn came after she was saying that politicians over 65 should have to take cognitive tests. Basically, she's trying to say Joe Biden is senile. At any rate, this like wokeness thing is like a huge talking point for all kinds of Republicans. Mike Pompeo had a different twist on basically the same idea, where he said that woke education is a bigger threat to America than the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, that's a good one too. We could have used, this is a good bad take because it's not just Nikki Haley.
I have more to say about pandemics than the Chinese Communist Party. But the point is that different Republican Party politicians, I think, are workshopping different versions of this joke, in which they want to say that wokeness, there's like something that people think is bad. And then they want to say that no, like wokeness is like, it's worse than that other thing.
I think you can see the trajectory over time of this sort of thing of, I remember back sort of in the aughts where liberal was a dirty word. Liberal was seen as a slur and no one wanted to be a liberal. And then, now it's now it's an attack line to call somebody a woke, I suppose, or that wokeness is bad. Liberalism was bad. Wokeness is now bad. It's all part of that same concept. But I think what's different about this wokeness moment is there's a question about what is woke. I say this because my mom was talking to me. This was fairly recently, and I was on a visit to California. I was with my mom, and she asked me. She said, "Am I woke?" She asked me this.
Is your mom woke? Would you say?
I really had to think about it, right? And I'm still thinking about what the answer is, because she's a retired kindergarten teacher. Since her retirement, she's become, I'd say, more liberal in her years, and she's definitely a liberal person. But I don't. No.
Plus a teacher. So, suspicion of being one of the woke educators who's a bigger threat than China.
Right. Is she a woke educator? But the reason I was sort of not sure if she's a woke versus a kind of classic liberal is on a number of fronts. So one, she was a teachers union member for many, many years.
That sounds pretty woke.
It's that, but see, is it?
Yeah.
I guess it is. Yeah, we could. Okay, yes, it is. It is. But it's sort of what I think it forced me to think about and I concluded that, yes, she is woke. And I told her she is woke. And she seemed relieved by this because she, likes to be up to date. She's in her 70s and she's very up to date on popular culture. And she always, she's a good dresser. She's a stylish woman. So, she wants to be up to date. And I agreed, yes, she is woke. But it did raise for me this sort of question of, and she was asking, what's the difference? And she learned about progressive a while ago. She went from being liberal to progressive and she wants to be on top of it. And I'm not saying this. I hope I don't sound like I'm being condescending to my mom. I think she legitimately reads a lot of news and she's up on everything. Was like, this is a legitimate question of what does it mean to be woke versus a liberal versus a progressive? And I would say, given my mom's basket of beliefs, she is woke. The reason I bring this up is because she is a smart, engaged person, and she forced me to think about what does it really mean? What does it mean?
But I think that this is correct, right? This is as is often the case. If you know how language works, words are kind of coined and they bounce around and their meaning shifts. And so one thing that is happening now is that the word woke is invoked so frequently by prominent right-wing figures as a term of derision that people like your mother, right? She knows that she's not a conservative. Right, like she's a veteran teacher and a union person, and so if you're a Republican and you hear people and all of a sudden they're talking about woke and they're saying it's bad, your instinct is to be like, well, probably whatever they're saying is bad is in fact bad. But if you're a Democrat, right, if you're somebody who's like not extremely online, not like eyeballs deep in the discourse, but you know you're a Democrat, and suddenly you hear Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump and Nikki Haley, they're all like, wokeness is terrible, wokeness is terrible. Your inclination is going to be like, oh, are they talking about me? Right? So you have a curiosity, and you could have further iterations. Now, a long time ago, 15 to 20 years ago, when I first heard the term woke, and it was not used on the internet, it was not in the discourse, this was African-American slang, and it meant something quite different. I mean, to be woke meant that you were awake, that your eyes were open to like the true nature of the world, right? Which sometimes had a very conspiratorial sort of aspect to it, and sometimes just meant that you were cognizant of like social issues. You know, like to stay woke meant that you weren't just a kind of self-interested person going about your business, that you were aware of injustice in society.
I would say that is still a layer to the term.
Well, yes, but it has then came to be as anti-racism became a more mainstream part of white liberal politics. Over time, right? I mean, it used to be the case that there was a progressive coalition in the United States of America that included Black people, white people, Latino people, all kinds of people, but that you didn't necessarily hear that much from white liberals about race and racism. But you started to hear more and more, right? It became more and more a kind of subject of preoccupation, at which point I think some Black people started as a kind of a joke, right? An affectionate joke, talking about white people becoming quote unquote woke.
Right. They're waking up to an issue that wasn't top of mind.
When I first moved to DC, I worked at a small liberal magazine, and it didn't have any Black editorial staffers. And we competed in the same space with several other sort of DC-based progressive magazines that also didn't have any Black editorial staffers. And these were liberal publications, like articles about how terrible George W. Bush was, sure, all that kind of stuff. But like there was a non-awakenness to like questions of diversity in a way that I think is unthinkable today. A self-consciously progressive institution would be awakened to why it might be problematic to have so little internal staff diversity. And as is often the case, there's a little bit of in-joking and humor and jocularity. Eventually, though, people started using it, I think liberal people, to indicate the idea that there was some kind of anti-racist or social justice activism that was going too far in some sense, right? That the person was making claims that seemed too extreme or wrong-headed. And so it was kind of moderate liberal or progressive people trying to distance themselves from far left perspectives by characterizing those far left perspectives as woke. It then jumped into conservative circles where the meaning becomes, I would say, very imprecise, because conservatives are like quite conservative and they view all kinds of things as too far left, right? Like they're not moderate liberals who see a small number of things as too far left. They think the Biden administration is much too far left, that the Obama administration was much too far left, that Bill Clinton was too far left. And so like everything is woke in the hands of Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley.
Not really. I would say that, so if you look at what Nikki Haley was, she's responding to Don Lemon, and then she pivots after she gives her line about wokeness. And she gets into how she says Democrats want you to believe that this is a racist country, and she says I'm the first minority woman to serve as a governor in the United States, and I'm here to tell you this is not a racist country. And I would say most of the time that you're hearing conservatives talk about wokeism, it's not like, oh, Democrats want a public option, it's so woke. It's within the context of these social issues around race, around gender identity, and to me that's what they're signaling, that there are a bunch of wokes who want to tell you you are a racist and that you don't, that you're you should accept these new ideas around gender. And so it's not just a sort of sense of, it's not woke isn't big spending liberal. It's got a different connotation to it.
Yes. It's clearly meant to refer to sort of social cultural issues. But I mean, I do think that the problem, it's not a problem even, but the ambiguity is that people kind of disagree as to, so you say, right, like new ideas about gender identity, et cetera, right? So I can get together in my, like moderate, middle-aged dad's club, and, we might sit around and like roll our eyes at, the claim that like there's no difference between men and women or something like that. And be like, like that's pretty woke, right? Like in a disparaging way. At the same time, if you're like, well, should abortion be legal? Then we're like, yeah, we're secular, college-educated Democrats who not only are pro-choice, but just like have been pro-choice for a long time. And this has been a very mainstream position in American politics for decades and decades and decades. But if you ask Nikki Haley, like, that's woke too, right? So she says, well, Democrats want you to believe this is a racist country. And the question is, like, what does that mean? Like, I agree that there are framings of that idea that seem overstated or bad to me. But also, like, does Nikki Haley think this is a country in which racism hasn't played a role in our history? That racism doesn't shape our society at all? Like, what, Tim Scott likes to say this too, right? It's like a great applause line for non-white conservatives to be like, Democrats want you to think this is a racist country, but I'm here as a non-white person to tell you it's not. And everybody claps. And I sit there and I'm like, that is a good line. That's good politics. But like, why did Nikki Haley run behind? Nikki Haley dramatically underperformed the electoral fundamentals in her first South Carolina governor's run in 2010. If you look at the share of the vote she got in a wave year for Republicans in a very conservative state, she did terribly. Why is that? I think it's because of racism. Like they threw up a non-white candidate and she underperformed considerably in South Carolina.
Well, look, she can have whatever take on that she wants of why she underperformed. But objectively speaking, if she took down the Confederate flag from the South Carolina Capitol building while she was in office, I mean, she literally dealt with a question of past and present, the bridging of past and present racism in the United States. And it's sort of like, maybe she has some insight here beyond America is not a racist country, where maybe she could add some nuance to what she means about that there is certainly a narrative there for her to talk about. She does not believe this is a racist country. Therefore, this Confederate flag is no longer who the people of the state of South Carolina are, and it should be gone, and et cetera. But she dealt with the question. She didn't dismiss it while in office. She's definitely had to face these questions, but now she's running for president, and she sees this as where she needs to be. Though personally, I don't know how this distinguishes her from other candidates. It seems like maybe she should try to make herself a little more distinct, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, no, but I mean, what I do think is true, right, is that if you're a Republican, if you want to say, okay, there are people who think that left-wing racial politics has gone too far in the country. But some of those people also think that like white racism is also a problem in American life. And you might be suspicious if you see somebody with, say, Donald Trump's track record out there complaining about wokeness. You're like, boy, I don't know, like what this guy is all about. You know, like he like literally had to settle housing discrimination lawsuits, decades ago, right? He has this incredible track record of being a racist. So when Trump comes out there and he's like, oh, I'm going to stop wokeness, you're like, are you going to repeal the Civil Rights Act? Like, what are you talking about? Nikki Haley, I think it's a better issue for her because of her identity, because of that track record with the Confederate flag, et cetera, she does have a certain inherent credibility as somebody who's saying, look, I'm going to try to check whatever you think the excesses of left-wing activism are without, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So to me, like, that makes sense. And I understand why she's reaching for, like, what's the biggest sort of rhetorical super uppercut I can deliver. And so what she's come up with is that it's a virus more dangerous than any pandemic. But then you're like back to the fact that like millions of people died around the world because of COVID. Like it's quite dangerous. It's like a weird bar to set. And I mean, literally what she said is not that wokeness is more dangerous than the COVID-19 pandemic, but that it's more dangerous than any pandemic. Like, what if the virus was 4 or 5 times as deadly? What if it was 10 times as deadly? What if bioterrorists unleash multiple unrelated engineered pandemics at the same time so that the world is hit with 7 different genetically distinct pandemics? Like,
I mean, I don't think you even need to get to that. I also think she was nodding to COVID, that is the idea. She's trying to say, the other thing she's clearly getting at here is when you're talking about the connection between wokeness and the COVID-19 pandemic, is she wants to get into parental rights, schools, education. Those are the things that I think she's talking about when she's trying to connect a criticism of the left by the right around this important moment. So I don't think, yes, if you take her literally, she's, is wokeness worse than the plague? I don't know. Maybe it's not. But certainly I think she's saying, COVID-19 was poorly handled by the left. And people are still dying of COVID today. Like, it's not, I mean, yes, I would say that, we're not in a pandemic level crisis anymore, but the thing kills people still, like, obviously. But I think that's the question is, where are conservatives taking this kind of basket of ideas when they're talking about wokeness and alluding to COVID-19? And I think it's this sort of stitching together of a racial critique on the left and of the idea of, there's a sense, I think, among plenty of people that there are factions of the left who went really far in continuing to keep schools closed, going hard on questions about masking and all of this. And I think that that's what it's all about. It's a sort of collective sense that, okay, there are people on the left who want to change how you think and how you live, and they don't get it. That they're telling you are dumb and believe in misinformation, but they themselves have this wild, extreme set of beliefs. And that's not new in conservative politics.
Something that conservatives have been able to take advantage of in this kind of dialogue is that I believe that there is a new set of ideological concepts afoot on the left on race and gender issues that are different from the ones that were mainstream 15 years ago, say. But the proponents of those views have not come up with a name for themselves. right? Which is a slightly distinctive thing, right? If somebody tells you like, I'm a liberal, you're like, okay, I an American, right? Because these words mean different things in different countries. But an American liberal says, I'm a liberal, especially on economic issues. I have a sense, without asking a lot of hyper detailed questions, what it is that person believes. And then if somebody says, I'm a socialist, right? I have a sense of socialism as a different set of economic beliefs that are more left-wing than mainstream liberalism. And that's a distinguished intellectual tradition. There are books in which people are like, I'm a socialist, here's what socialism is. There are intra-socialist debates about what socialism ought to amount to. There are political parties and factions. There's the Democratic Socialists of America. At the same time, there has been the rise of a set of ideas and thinkers that I think are clearly more left-wing than the ideas of like mainstream American liberalism in the first decade of the 21st century. But they don't have a name for themselves, right? So other people come up with names for them. So for a long time, people would talk about social justice warriors, or they would shorten it as SJWs. Or now they'll talk about wokeism. Conservatives will say these things. And because conservatives are conservative, they will like mix together, right? I think like Ibram Kendi's ideas with the idea that like there should be a civil rights division of the Justice Department. And it's all wokeism to them, which is to their instrumental interest because like they are right wing in the exact same way that when Barack Obama was trying to do the Affordable Care Act, conservatives called him a socialist, right? But then liberals would say, no, this isn't socialism. And socialists would also say, no, this isn't socialism. Because socialism exists not only as an intellectual tendency, but as like a movement with a name, right? Whereas I struggle as a writer to identify, like, what is the name that the people would give to themselves, right? The people who believe, like, there's this woman, Tema Okun, and she's a DEI trainer. She has this book about confronting white supremacy, and she has this document about the elements of white supremacist culture that gets used in a lot of trainings in different settings. And she says things that like an emphasis on the written word is an aspect of white supremacist culture, right? Or that like. That to me is a striking claim, right? That is different from standard issue American liberalism, but I don't know what the shorthand word for that is. And it's created a problem. I shouldn't say a problem. It's created an opportunity for conservatives who want to debunk like everything in progressive politics, that there's no clear distinction between Okun and Obama.
Yeah, I would say that that is not a bug, but a feature. So as an example, so if you take the trans rights movement and look at how they have integrated themselves with sort of larger liberal politics, that if somebody is sort of not on board, they're targeted as an outsider, right? That you are anti-trans, that you are transphobic. And the idea is that the trans movement is mainstream, that I actually think they've been very effective as a movement and sort of leapfrogging over it like very rapidly going from a kind of movement that's fighting to get into the mainstream to saying we are the mainstream in a way. And if you don't agree with us, you are the problem, that we have these mainstream ideas. And I think you see the same thing around the kind of anti-racist movement, that if you disagree, like you are a racist, that you are the extreme one, that these beliefs are mainstream beliefs. If you don't buy into them, racist is extreme, right? Like you are on the outside and you are not in the middle, and you have patently terrible beliefs if you don't support this movement. So I don't think it would make sense. Like if that is your strategy as a movement to get your agenda, sounds loaded, but regardless, whatever your values, your agenda is, if your goal is to get yourself in the position of being mainstream and part of the center of, kind of accepted, if you were to give yourself a name that is separate, then you're inherently putting yourself as a separate group, which is going to make it harder to have your strategy of saying, no, we are, we are just part of the mainstream ideas, and you are an outlier if you don't agree.
No, I mean, I completely agree with that. There's been a kind of useful symmetry between like the far left and the right to blur these distinctions in a way that has like squeezed people out in the middle, right? By creating a challenge to sort of define a space that is, I don't know, like ideas that people would have recognized as progressive 5 to 10 years ago, right? But that are not like there shouldn't be any police departments or things like that, right? It's instrumentally useful to everybody, but I think it's bad for like public understanding. It's bad for politics, et cetera, other things. Can we take a break though? Because I want to talk about the threat inflation aspect of this. So something that worries me a lot about the Haley version of this, and even more so Pompeo's version of this formulation, is that, the United States is a democracy, right? We have free speech, we have contested elections, we have hundreds of millions of people live here. People disagree about things.
These are all true. I agree with all of this, Matt. Sorry. I love a wind-up, but yes, I agree. That is our democratic system.
I think it becomes really bad for the country when people define their domestic political opponents as like actually more dangerous than these kind of like alien threats, right? Like,
yes.
Then, no, I mean, of course, there's something you could say, right? I could be like, supply side economics is more dangerous than any mudslide, right? But that's me saying that like mudslides are not that big of a deal. If you get to the point, because it's obviously true, like the stakes are high in domestic politics. Like people care a lot about winning these arguments, but also like no matter what happens in America, there's going to be people who you disagree with about issues that you think are important. Those people are going to have some measure of political power. They're going to govern some places. You're going to think it's like a serious problem. And yet, like, we have to be able to collaborate as a society on questions like, are we going to let viruses kill millions of people? Are we going to let hostile foreign powers take over the world? Right? Like we managed historically to get where we are as a society by like doing politics in a vigorous, meaningful way without painting the domestic political opposition as this kind of internal enemy, right? Because that's how, that's how you lead to like secret police jailing political dissidents.
Well, I don't think Haley invented this. This has been going on since, I'd say you can track a lot of this back to, really, well, you can go back further and further, but, really, I think you could draw a line between Newt Gingrich and the current Republican Party and the way that the right has talked about the left in the last few decades. And I agree with you, but at the same time, I'm not sure that that's a realistic thought. You're not an author of speeches that are going to be read at CPAC, and I think that there's a reason. I don't know that your speech about how we need to come together to tackle big problems is really going to fire up the base. And like, look, I get your point, right? So two things. One, I both agree that I think that we should have constructive, collaborative political disagreements. And also there's a reason we don't, which is that the Republican Party has decided this is the most effective way to win elections.
But I mean, so I want to contest this on a few different levels, right? I mean, when George W. Bush was president, like, he played hardball politics. He played to win. He was not above some demagogic attacks on his enemies. And, you know, he leveraged the politics of terrorism and of 9/11 against his domestic opponents in ways that were sometimes cynical, were sometimes really, really tough, were really, really harsh. He did not say, though, like, tax and spend Democrats are a bigger threat to the country than Al-Qaeda. Like, he just didn't. You know, like, there was a line that he didn't cross, in part because he took his vision of the war on terrorism seriously, you know, and didn't want to compromise it on some level, but also because it's good, like, applause line at CPAC to go for like maximal, I'm going to destroy my enemies kind of stuff. But it's not obvious to me that that's like great general election politics, right? Like, Donald Trump was just a master of this kind of polarize everything, divide everything universe. But I don't think that worked out very well for him politically. Like, he kept blowing up. Well, right. But I mean, it's not just that he lost in 2020, but like, he blew an opportunity to sort of experience the COVID pandemic as like a unifying rally around the flag type event. Lots of leaders around the world saw big public approval bumps during that original COVID summer and fall because they, you know, they became leaders of the country.
So I want to just clarify my point, which was I said that the Republican Party seems to believe that this is the right way, that I'm not saying it is, but that is where things are.
No, I know. I just like, I want to talk everybody down off this cliff a little bit. Like successful politicians, Ronald Reagan didn't say Walter Mondale is worse than communism. And he beat him like quite badly in elections by just saying he's bad. He said Ronald Reagan, he said Walter Mondale is worse than me. Because that's the election.
So, okay, but so what is I think that I'm surprised that you're kind of going here because I think you've been over the years a little bit skeptical of the democracy. You know, we should really be concerned about democratic institutions, and this is, you know, very worrisome. And so is that what you're saying, that like that the natural end to this is a threat to democracy, and that is what the problem is?
I mean, I don't know. You know, I don't know what is happening, but I just think it's important as public figures to take note and call this kind of thing out. Like, look, it's a speech, right? Like, people use over the top rhetoric all the time. And it is what it is. But like, it's too much. It's too far, you know, to say that people disagreeing with you winning elections is like worse for the country than horrible disasters, you know? And like, I would like to see people who, you know, do interviews and stuff, like, ask about this a little bit more. Like, when you said it's worse than any pandemic, like, what did you mean? And she says it'd be like, do you mean just like worse than COVID or worse than any pandemic that's ever happened? Like, the Black Death killed a third of the population of Europe.
Well, and also, I actually would be interested in the flip side from her, which is, has wokeism actually killed anybody? You know, what do you mean that it's deadly?
Well, even like, I think you could make the argument that, you know, police reform activism is 100% responsible for the increasing crime that occurred.
Maybe. I mean, but she doesn't even, maybe she believes that. I would be interested in hearing more from her.
No, but I mean, I'm just saying, I think it's useful to drag people out on this. And then you can say, okay, if you grant that for the sake of argument, so how many deaths is it responsible for? And it's like about 20,000 on that account, which is a lot of people, but way fewer than COVID, right? And just because I think it would be incredibly productive for America to hear somebody, to hear Nikki Haley or Mike Pompeo or some other Republican, to hear Kevin McCarthy or Mitch McConnell, like, just like publicly state that, like, that's not true. To be like, I have a strongly held disagreement about important public policy issues with the Democrats. I think these things matter. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm trying to win the election. But, like, it's not as big a deal as she just said, right? Like, it's just like, it's a spirit that, like, needs to be injected into the discourse. It's a reason that I try to push back against some of the democracy doomerism from the left, too, because I think that the people who engage in that rhetoric sometimes don't understand the extent to which it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, warning that if Ron DeSantis sweeps into office, he could cost millions of people their health care. Like, that's a perfectly good reason to vote against the guy. You don't need to, like, break out the most extreme rhetorical ammunition. Like, these elections happen. They only have 2 candidates in them. You should vote for the better candidate in the election. You don't need to tell people that the other person winning is, like, the end of the country. And when I hear people saying it, and I think it's good that, like, Joe Biden mostly doesn't say that. Like, he maintains a sense of respectful political dialogue, which I appreciate. I think other people appreciate. And I also think, like, helps avert some of this cascading collapse scenarios that left-wing people worry about.
One thing I wish in all of this is, I thought it was right kind of the eve of the midterms, there was a clip that went around of Barack Obama really just being kind of funny about talking about some of it. Was in the context if someone believed something kind of just out there, nutty, obviously fake, obviously not real. And he was very funny about it, kind of dismissing it. And I do wish we saw that sometimes. Kevin McCarthy, if he would just once in a while, it's like, hey, Marjorie Taylor Greene said X. What do you say? If he just sort of rolled his eyes and said, I don't know what Marjorie's thinking half the time, or whatever, like, just a sort of, yeah, of course that's not true. I don't know, ask her what she means about the policy, like, sort of just acknowledging that this is just dumb. Like, if there was just a more, like, a sense of, wow, that's dumb, I'm not defending that, talk to her about whatever. I mean, but that's not what happens. It's this dug in approach to, I'm going to defend the wackiest thing ever and just not acknowledge it. And then it just creates this sense of identity over reality that drives the whole political party. And I think that that's what you're starting to get with this stuff, where you have political attacks that are, beyond reality. It's all built. The building blocks are all there day to day to day. And it's not surprising to me. And it just really frustrates me on a day to day level when there isn't more of just gentle dismissing of nonsense that I think the rest of us in the, living our lives would just, if a colleague said something like that to me, I'd be like, well, that person, I don't know. I would just dismiss it, or maybe kind of dismiss it in a meeting. I don't know. To your point on the left, I have not heard the Ron DeSantis anti-democratic argument quite as much. I do think he's new and emerging, so certainly that could happen and that could be the argument, but I just haven't heard it. And so I do think it's important in terms of specificity to look at what is being said. And I do think that there was, around Donald Trump, this real characterization of him as an existential threat. And Joe Biden did talk about that in the run-up to the midterms, and I was somewhat surprised. And it seems like it resonated with a lot of voters. And I'm not saying that the left doesn't do this, but I have not seen it in the same way. And, we did an episode where we talked about the attack on Paul Pelosi and the escalating use of violence and dehumanization of liberal figures. And I don't want to create some sense of false equivalency here of what's going on.
Well, here's where where I actually see the biggest disequivalency is that, again, like it's a big country. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people saying over the top things. People on the left say over the top things all the time, just as people on the right do. So there is an equivalency there. Where I think there's a non-equivalency is that over the top claims from the left get contested by liberals in liberal spaces. So I have read some, I think, over the top claims about DeSantis, but I also read like a New York Times op-ed by Damon Linker saying that people should like chill out and be less over the top about this. What disturbs me about the Nikki Haley speech is not just like that she said it, but that conservatives, by the way their institutions function, like don't contest that, right? Like there's no article in National Review where somebody is like, hey, Nikki Haley, like, I think wokeism is bad, but like pandemics are worse, right? There's nobody saying, hey, Mike Pompeo, like, I get what you're driving at here, but like the Chinese Communist Party is operating a network of concentration camps where they perpetrate genocide against Uyghur. You know what I mean? So it's the fact that there's not just over-the-top rhetoric coming from certain conservative figures, but that the movement as a whole is just kind of awash in this uncontested extremism, which encourages more and more politicians to do it and to be sloppier and sloppier. I think there's nobody on the speechwriting team for any Republican politician who's doing the like, hey, wait, like, do we really want to say that? Kind of check, right? Instead, it's a competition to be like, now that we've decided wokeism is bad, who can come up with the most over-the-top way to make that claim, right? And that's bad. That's a bad trajectory for society, especially because it's such an imprecise target. Like, what is the wokeism that Nikki Haley is complaining about exactly? Like, is it Eric Adams? Is it Joe Biden? Is it like who? Like what are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Republican Party used to be much better at catchphrases and bumper sticker politics, like axis of evil. That's some good stuff right there. You don't hear, I'm not hearing that kind of that sort of speech writing.
Well, and that was David Frum, who's like joined the resistance now.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know if there's a speech writing divide that's going on, but the great Republican speechwriters of our time are just not writing speeches for Nikki Haley anymore. I don't know, but I think that you're looking at what is, to me, I think you're agreeing with me about this frustration of the policy writ large of just not acknowledging nonsense, and that leads to more nonsense, and that is bad. And I agree with that, especially around COVID, which there's been I've seen chatter recently, sort of post energy, the Department of Energy's report on the lab leak, and is it to what extent is this theoretically possible? And I've seen on the left some people say things to the effect of, we need to move on. Like, we need to move on from this debate over how the COVID pandemic started, which I think is wild. I mean, it's like, of course we need to know how it started. That's how you maybe could prevent a future pandemic. And, that's, I think, an example of circling around each other in a way that says, okay, we're not going to actually force our side to have a discussion about what we know and what we don't know, and to have a real conversation about what we should really be thinking about when it comes to China and labs and all this. I think that the idea of we need to move on and not talk about this is certainly being seen there, and it's stunting important policy debate.
Yes. I mean, I agree with that. And there are these different kinds of sort of dysfunctional, habits. Like, I mean, if you want to talk about wokeism too, in this context, I mean, to me at least, right? I have now tried to like move beyond this word because it's become such a sort of toxic landscape. But one iteration of the lab leak debate was certain people in the media insisting that it was racist to want to like explore the hypothesis that lab mishaps were at the root here. And I do think that that is a distinct like intellectual trend on the left to want to sort of go, I don't quite know what to say, but to sort of like have people like outdo one another in their ability to call out different things as racist when they don't actually seem to be racist.
I see what you're saying on that, but I also see this sort of collision or muddied. You have, like you're saying, you know, there is a heightened, larger movement around on the left around questions of race and how race affects life in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. Also, at the same time, there is the liberal value of we support science and we support scientists. And then there's something going on here with the collision of these two things around identity questions and science, where talking about science is not seen as separate from identity issues. And that's what's going on. You know, the criticism of New York Times trans coverage, one of the critiques was that some of the articles are dealing with, they try to cover a lot of ground, right? So you've got these different layers of things that are going on, where, you know, it's medical treatment for children. It's some doctors are concerned, other doctors are not. And then is this political layer of there's a movement to try to push really, you know, extreme laws in different states around this. So you have these different things going on at once. And that when you're injecting political criticism into this conversation, it seems to be muddying the conversation that's happening in the medical community, which is then seen as that this is a political debate, and that you're doing a false equivalency with people who are attacking the LGBT community, and it overshadows this other conversation that's happening around what do we know about using, you know, puberty blockers in children. And I see that happening in the China case, and I see it happening, you know, now around these questions of how to best serve kids with gender dysphoria. So I kind of see it that way more so. I mean, I do think there is a Twitter phenomenon of people trying to one-up each other in all kinds of ways, and I think you see it on race, but I see it just as, you know, a phenomenon on Twitter in general of trying to one-up each other.
No, I mean, I agree, and there's I think, I don't want to go off on a totally new tangent, but I mean, I wrote a piece about this. I think particularly on some trans-related issues, there's a desire to sort of try to infer factual conclusions from values premises. You know, so like Reuters did an investigation in which they said they looked at these clinics and they were not, in fact, using the WPATH standards of care, that they were engaged in something much more lax. And that article was sort of received by the community as like an attack on trans rights or on trans dignity, or was just sort of not discussed on the left. But it's a factual question. Like, their reporting might be wrong. There have been articles published over the years that turn out to be factually inaccurate. But, you know, you would need to contest that. Like, you would need to investigate the claims and see what's true and what isn't true. And, you know, when people believe so strongly in their values that they want to say that just kind of overrides factual concerns, you get a problem. And we were talking about police, right? I mean, I think there was a palpable sense of outrage at George Floyd's murder and a powerful desire to do something that would lead to things like that not happening, which is admirable. But that then led people to start making, I think, some like very untenable claims about like the viability of not having police forces. Right. And that's like a very sloppy habit to be like, I am so outraged by this act of police misconduct that I'm now going to tell you that radically revamping the municipal budget won't have certain consequences so that we can ignore the academic literature on these subjects. And that's a very, it's a sloppy intellectual habit. It is bad for America. I understand why Republicans have hit on this as a political vulnerability for Democrats. It makes total sense to me. This is like, to an extent, what I would be doing if I was in their shoes. But I just do keep coming around to the fact that like, we have to have some, I don't know, like precision in the claims that we make about the world, some sense of perspective in the arguments that we offer. And, that's what really rubbed me the wrong way about Haley.
What rubbed me the wrong way about it was that I don't think she even believes it. Like she's a smart person who totally does not believe this thing that she is saying. And the point of running for office is to tell people what you think and what you're going to do to solve problems. And it's like that doesn't matter anymore, which I think is an offshoot perhaps of what you're saying. But it's really frustrating to watch a presidential field shaping up in this way when we really do have some pandemic problems going on that we need to address. So I agree. I think it's a bad take. I think we agree. Okay.
Okay. I mean, it's an agreeable show. This has been another episode of Bad Takes from Grid. We are produced, as usual, by District Productive, and we'll be back next week with more Bad Takes.